can write their questions in the chat, and Josephine will let us know about the questions. Over to you, Coco. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. And Danya, thanks for the kind introduction. For those of us who haven't had a chance to meet, it's really great to be with you here. And also for the many colleagues joining us online, your work in humanitarian space is really important, and its importance is growing. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's really wonderful to join you. Just a little bit of a background. As you said, Danya, my name is Coco Warner. I join you most recently from the climate change impact space. So I'm coming over from, climate policy and climate action. And you can see, among many other growing stressors, some of the challenges that we're up against. And that is what this community, and also one reason why it's really fantastic to be with you, this community of data collectors and providers is providing an evidence base for the action that we're taking to understand the results that we're getting for the many beneficiaries worldwide, and also to pave the path forward. The stressors, unfortunately, aren't going away. They're growing in complexity and connections. And whether it be rapidly emerging situations like we've seen in the last week or so in the Sudan, unfolding droughts, heat episodes, or other kinds of stresses, we hope that data and evidence provide us an idea of what to do. And more than any other sector that I know of, the humanitarian sector really focuses on delivering effective action to keep people safe and get them back on the road that they want to be on, which is sustainable and good lives. So with that, I'd like to just introduce our session and the objectives, and then we're going to turn to what you really came for, which is our fantastic panel. So as you may know, this session is organized by IOM's Displacement Tracking Matrix in collaboration with many partners. This session provides a chance to reflect. This work together, which we're going to introduce, has been going on for some years now. So there's a lot of reflection on approaches, evidence, and ways forward. And we're going to hear again from a wonderful panel that will look at global areas of responsibility. So we're looking at child protection, mine action and gender-based violence, and global protection cluster activities. So we're going to look at how common processes help gather evidence that really informs action. So let me quickly talk about the objectives for this session. There's so much to be said about the background, but in 2017, the Displacement Tracking Matrix co-led the working group for useful and usable data under the Grand Bargain for needs assessment. That was the work stream under the Grand Bargain, as you know. Now this EDA-UUR, which is the Working Group on Useful and Usable Data and Analysis, was composed of many partners. I'll name just a few. We have the global clusters and the AORs, including all of our panelists that represent their organizations, as well as a number of UN agencies, including OCHA, World Food Program, UNHCR, of course, IOM and UNICEF, as well as the many member states and other donors that support this work. I'll name USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, UK's FCDO, ECHO, as well as civil society and many other organizations and initiatives. So you see so many organizations coming together around data, common approaches, and all directed towards action. There's a lot more that could be said, but since many of you might already be part of this multi-year effort, I think that I would quickly review the common pillars of these common approaches. So I'm just going to read these. There are 6 of them. The common pillars of cooperation are following a common process around data and evidence. Data experts work with decision makers, as well as topical and content experts or subject matter experts. using appropriate methods and source for each type of information, keeping the link between data, analysis, and use, using all available and reliable data for analysis, and sharing the responsibility to cooperate effectively. So that's the work that's been going on. And what we'll do here is hear the experiences, and then you'll have a chance as an audience to interact with the panelists and really talk about the good, maybe some areas for improvement and ways forward. And I really invite you to take advantage of that. It's important to be candid as much as we can, because as I said at the beginning, the challenges of our time are very big, and there are very big hopes that the humanitarian sector can continue in effective ways to work together and really meet the needs of affected and vulnerable people. So with that, let's turn first to Crystal Luke Forrest, who's the director, the Deputy Global Coordinator of the Global Mine Action Area of Responsibility. Crystal, you're going to tell us about the cooperation between UNFPA and Mine Action colleagues and the displacement tracking matrix in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Mali. And these, of course, are areas with a lot going on today. So we'll be very interested in your comments. And after that, I'll just introduce our speakers one by one very briefly. Crystal?
Thank you very much, Coco. Just to clarify, so I work for the UN Mine Action Service, but very closely with my UNFPA colleagues from the gender-based violence AOR. So about 4 years ago, Dania and Risky came to us with this proposal for a partnership. And the Mine Action AOR is a very small, AOR, and so we really are interested in partnering with colleagues and, not duplicating. So first we were quite interested with the proposal of Dania. But then we thought, there's a lot of actors in the data management space, and why should we pick DTM versus another one? Because partnerships are also very time consuming. So we had a workshop with actually Andrew from the GICHD and many colleagues from the Mine Action AOR and the protection cluster. And we looked at all the different, basically our information needs in the mine action sector, in emergencies, and whether some of the different information management tools or initiatives, whether they could meet these needs. And Risky, you remember, you came to that very productive workshop focused on data sharing. And Risky basically made the case for DTM, and I think everybody thought, oh, this is the low-hanging fruit. It's already there, it's working. They have a huge network of enumerators collecting data. You told us 14,000 in Afghanistan, and I was like, yes, we want to partner with them. And so we went ahead and developed this partnership at the global level with a tool to collect information for mine action using the DTM systems. And then we ask our coordinators, we have coordinators in about 16 countries, and we asked them, could we, would you be interested in piloting this in your own country? And 3 accepted to do it immediately. And this is their, basically the result of this cooperation. So in Ethiopia, where we had to quickly start up a mine action AOR not too long ago, due to the conflict in northern Ethiopia, DTM really helped UNMAS and the MAOR to collect data in northern Ethiopia. UNMAS identified information needs, and the DTM included 3 questions in their questionnaire. And this helped the AOR to understand the IDP's perception of contamination and to raise visibility of the situation in Tigray, which was crucial to make the case for the activation of the AOR and to get funding to start up mine action operations. remember that access to Tigray, that was last year, right, was very difficult. So for us to have information from DTM was crucial because we didn't have a lot of presence to give us data. Secondly, so second example, Nigeria. So in Nigeria, we used data that we received through DTM system to prioritize operation by comparing the analysis of the DTM with the analysis that we get from the information management system on mine action. So you see here we have already a system, so we can triangulate compared to Ethiopia where we didn't have an IMSMA in place. And then the MAAOR, they used this data to identify which communities had not received risk education, and also looking at where we could see the most explosive ordnance accidents, people killed and injured by accidents, and then prioritize based on that. And so that's where the DTM enumerators help us to prioritize that. And then the third example is in Mali. There DTM help us to enhance en masse capacity to analyze also the perception among certain communities on the presence of explosive ordnance in places where there had been displacement or place of origin, to think about possibility of return. So that's also has been quite helpful. So that's the 3 examples where we've had successes. So these are some, to give you an idea of the data that we collect. This map shows that the humanitarian response plan in 2023, in the local government areas where respondents agreed to have received EURE sessions. So there, we could see, okay, here they've already received EURE, risk education, in the past year. So then we can prioritize areas where they haven't received risk education just yet. This to give you an idea of how those risk education sessions take place. We try very much to localize our risk education. And this one, it's an analysis of explosion, where you have the most explosions and where we really need to prioritize risk education. I have to tell you that the Nigerian forces don't allow us to do clearance, so that's why risk education is what we do to mitigate the risk. Now, challenges. Ethiopia, my colleagues mentioned the competition with other sectors to incorporate questions in the DTM questionnaire, because of course so many actors want to have your enumerators ask questions. So they mentioned that. My colleagues in Nigeria spoke about sometimes seeing discrepancies between the data collected from our own information management system, the IMSMA, and the DTM. And also another challenge, the quick turnover of information management officers without proper handover and notes for follow-up. So that's also a challenge in our community. And finally, in Mali, the main challenge was the geographic coverage. Because some of the areas where we would like to have information are outside the scope of the DTM assessment. So we would need additional funding to cover the areas that are not covered so far. So lessons learned, partnership, successful in collecting data that the MAOR used to prioritize response, filling the gaps in the case of Ethiopia, helping to corroborate information in the case of Nigeria, so as to prioritize risk education. And another lessons learned is that the collaboration works when the mine action AORs have clarity on their information needs and gaps. And also when DTM clearly communicates what are the strengths and limitations of the tool. So basically we really need to start about what are the decisions we need to make, and then see what are the information needs. And we also realize the importance of contextualizing the questions in collaboration with the DTM teams. Of course, there's a language question And for us, it's quite important because, you know, we say explosive ordnance to talk about mines, improvised explosive devices, explosive remnants of wars, cluster munition. You can imagine that in different parts of the world, they call this differently. So we need to use the right language to help people, you know, ask the right questions. So that's really important. And then careful comparative analysis is required when there are discrepancies between your findings and our findings so that we can, you know, make the right decision and use funding effectively. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Really appreciate that, Crystal. Oh, clap. So useful. I think one thing that really came out clearly to me is what do you do when you have a data collection infrastructure? And in this case, displacement tracking matrix. How do you use it? What are some of the lessons learned that was extremely helpful? And I think a question for us moving forward is, if you have this infrastructure, how do we build on these important lessons learned, become more efficient, more effective, and really bring the eyes and experiences of people at the front lines of these challenges to a variety of people who can take action and make decisions. Really helpful. Thank you. Let's go on next to Joyce Mutiso, who's joining us from online. And while we're getting her geared up, let me just introduce Joyce. Joyce is the Deputy Coordinator of the Global Child Protection, AOR. And we might also be hearing from a colleague, Lilian Kona and Ismail Mohammed, who are respectively Coordinator and Information Management Officer for the Child Protection AOR in Somalia. Joyce and Lillian and Ismail, just checking if we have you online. And again,
Yeah.
thanks, Crystal.
You do.
Wonderful.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm online.
Thank you so much. So my role here is quite brief. I would like to introduce Lilian Kona, who's the coordinator of the Child Protection Area of Responsibility in Somalia, and Ismail Mohammed, who's the Information Management Officer. Thank you, Lilian, for joining us. So would like today to share our experience on how we were able to make decisions on how to integrate child protection response within the drought crisis and response in Somalia to make sure that protection and child protection is prioritized. Of course, using information that we've had from previous learnings with the drought crisis that has been going on for a number of years in the Horn of Africa. And Lilian and Ismail will share their experience of the decisions that they made and how they were able to collect information and data to support the response, particularly the minimum service response package that the child protection actors agreed to in Somalia. So without further ado, Lilian and Ismail, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. And it's afternoon in Somalia, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us to share. As Joyce did brief, Somalia for the most of 2022 was hit by a severe drought. If you can go to the next slide, it could help us. So the drought in the country was recorded as the worst in the last 40 years. And with it, it saw a huge displacement of over 1 million people displaced due to droughts and seeking for food or other solutions. And in this displacement, the majority of those that were displaced, 66%, were actually children. In total, 7.1 million were facing severe food shortages, according to the Food Security and Nutrition Unit that was monitoring this. And in this, in some parts of the country, about 250,000 people facing catastrophic IPC5 levels. And then we also saw a rise in food prices that ended up possibly driving negative coping mechanisms that would end up being protection risks across the country, and then severe malnutrition in some instances, with the risk of having lots of children lose their lives due to hunger. As such, this became an issue for the whole of the humanitarian community to address. For the most part, the response was skewed towards, what was called as life-saving then, to avert death, and it was mainly food assistance, livelihood assistance, wash assistance, nutrition assistance, and health assistance. The other types of assistance were kind of deprioritized or put at the back burner, and that was a wake-up call for us child protection colleagues to see how best to get the protection issues back on the agenda. There's someone who is, to get the protection aspects back on the agenda, and we needed evidence to back that up. And for the rest of the presentation, we are going to be sharing how we got that evidence that helped us to get to remain relevant, and also to ensure that we protect children even during the drought. So we know from historical information and historical data. If you will excuse me, there's someone, Kamar Iqbal. The screen is blocking my presentation. So if you could just minimize yours so that I can see the entire screen.
And
Sorry
also
about
just
that.
and also Lillian, just to reassure you, at least for those of us in the room, we're able to see your presentation, but it might not be so for everybody.
Yeah, because
online.
I cannot read it. I'm not reading it from my
Exactly.
side. So it's kind
The
of being
slide that we're
blocked by.
on, I'm sorry, Lillian, the slide
Is on
we're
the
on is
third
impact
slide.
of drought. Mhm.
Yes. So from historical information here, the drought impacts children in different ways. So one in terms of risks, the other on households generally, and then on the services and how our services are being delivered. So we know there's mass separation with a lot of displacement. There's mass separation of families, and as such, lots of unaccompanied and separated children, including child-headed households, and this became a reality in Somalia. Sexual violence was reported among adolescent girls, including aspects to do with, exploitation. Increased reports of child marriages were recorded, exploitative labor, behavioral changes that increase psychosocial distress, and then concerns on possibility of recruitment and use of children. Somalia has for a long time had conflict, and that conflict oftentimes we have children being used in armed conflict. In terms of households, worsening protective environments, negative coping mechanisms that includes labor and then also malnutrition. Some families were forcefully getting children to be malnourished in order to get assistance, intimate partner violence, and then also displacements of different families because of rejection as part of protection, and then safety concerns. And then in terms of service delivery, how the services were being impacted on our side. Most of our child protection services became overstretched. We had our case management services not able to, to scale up to the extent possible, with almost one social worker or one case worker ending up having maybe 10,000 children to deal with, or 1,000 children to deal with, and yet we have a standard of about 35 or 45 to one social worker. And then the different service points that we had, including interim care centers or facilities, all those ended up being overstretched at some point, and then the increased need of PSS. With this at the back of our mind, and with the situation and the decisions made at interagency level in terms of what to do for drought response and to prevent famine, we then had to look into where data and how much data we can get to analyze and to get us to prioritization. So the next portion of the presentation is going to be delivered by my colleague Ismail, who is the Information Management Officer, and that was engaged mainly in the data analysis, and it will be showing you how we worked with different pieces of evidence to get us to prioritization, decision making, and advocacy to include child protection in the response. Over to you, Ismail.
Thank you very much, Lillian. Thank you, Joyce. For me, I'm just going to tell you how after analysis how we arrived at 3 priority areas for all the districts, as you can see in that map on the left. And this one was really done through the IPC FSNAU, the Food Security and Nutrition update data. And this data was able to help us understand the food security issue in Somalia in regards to the drought. And the districts in priority, especially priority 1 and 2, were regarded as high famine risks, and needed evidence to bring in child protection issues. And through these issues, so through this, we're able to bring in the FSNAU data, then the CCM new arrival tracker, which was able to show us how the population were moving, where they were going, the drought affected population. And this was able to help us also in planning. And the UNHCR PRMN data, that is the protection monitoring network. And this one actually gave us data beyond the drought movement. That's also include return. And due to the drought, actually, there was a lot of movement in Somalia. And the pyramid was able to give us the picture, actually, for other than the drought, what others beyond the IDPs and other groups that are being affected, and how the other groups are being affected. Because a lot of data that we were having was on IDPs, but we couldn't. But now the pyramid was able to give us a picture on the other groups as well. We also worked on the nutritional data gum rates, especially for children under 5, and this was able. Now we are also able to extrapolate it to understand how the drought was affecting generally children. So maybe in the next slide, the methodology that we used mostly was the secondary data review, which was being updated quarterly, and where we had information gaps. So we leveraged on existing child protection monitoring systems like MRM, CPMS to inform risk analysis, and you can see this from the map on the right side, in which 96% of the violation occurred. It shows that occurred in drought response operation priority areas 1 and 2 districts. Okay, and you can see 57% in OPA 1 and 39% in drought operation prioritized district 2. And the other thing is we conducted child protection capacity mapping to inform response planning. We have included a link there. And this one, the capacity mapping, so we're able also to do our staff mapping, okay, as well as the funding gapping. We were able now to tell, to ask partners, I mean, our members, child protection members in general, to tell us if their funding is also flexible. It can be diverted to drought response for those who are using their funding for others, and we're able to now. We were able now to map and understand who is where and who has flexible funding that can be used for others, and also we're able to understand from this capacity mapping on, staff mapping how many child protection staffs are there, how many are trained to handle case management, and where are they, and also preparing them for other modalities in case for maybe mobile modalities if they were there. And also from this, we're able now to understand the facilities like community-based structures, child desks, and all those, and the rest of the committees that can be utilized for this particular route. And also using this prioritization, we were able also to understand the area-based coordination. And in this, we conducted joint child protection and GBV rapid assessment in districts with IPC 4 and 5 through our subnational coordination. And also to be able to inform us correctly. So that's all from my side. Maybe back to you on the next slide, Lillian. Okay.
Lillian, are you there?
Uh-oh, I was talking to myself. Apologies
Yes.
for that. So if you get the presentation later, we had also included a snapshot of other risks and trends that we know do exist in Somalia amidst droughts and famine. So we wanted to use the evidence or the data that we got through the cross triangulation of the information there to also keep addressing other needs and trends. So I will be presenting how we eventually pivoted the response. Our response was pivoted around 5 main pillars. One, the operational capacity as Ismail has presented. So the decisions we made to where we have some level of operational capacity and area-based coordination in order to coordinate with others. We decided to develop what we call a minimum response package, and that package was a prioritized set of activities that can be that can address immediate life-threatening concerns. So it's what we called as life-saving child protection package, which we can also share with everyone. Why we had to do this prioritization is to fall in line with the trajectory that was agreed upon in Somalia to immediately look at life-saving and get into life-sustaining after we have averted some form of death. We also decided to utilize an integrated approach, and in that way we increased engagement with nutrition, education, food security, livelihoods, and the cash working group, mainly to integrate child protection in their responses. So we also worked with CCCM to add awareness in the new arrival awareness package, to add child protection, risk prevention, and risk mitigation messaging, referral systems, and all that in order to make use of their footprint and their capacity in there. We also looked into expanding the response in different locations, hard to reach, inaccessible areas, and we strengthened referrals in between. So I will just wrap up with the last slide that gives you a snapshot of how the response eventually came out based on all the analysis that we had. So we had the first line response as highlighted with a few activities. When we have the second line, and then we had adjustments on how to respond in accessible and hard to reach areas across the response. And this is how eventually child protection was adopted in the first line response in Somalia. So I will stop there and open up for any questions, if any. We we still have some more information on how the monitoring and evaluation and reporting and information sharing is going on, because we are still in the response, and we are happy to share that if given another opportunity. Thank you.
Really want to thank you, Joyce, as well as Lillian and Ismail, for those insights about data collection for action in Somalia. I found the maps that you used really illuminating, especially the first map I think that Lillian showed some of the areas of greatest displacement and movement. And then this map that just was showed in some ways reflected the intensity of stress that children in those areas might be experiencing. And just as a commentary before we go on, I think this is an example of how a common approach can provide disaggregated data about subsets of populations that we're really concerned about serving, like children in areas experiencing extreme stress, and providing an idea of what's the spatial distribution, how is it playing out temporally, what are other connections. And for those of you who do provide these really important actions, you see that data and evidence really provides that ability to provide assistance and to help beneficiaries in a timely way. That was really useful. Thank you so much. Let's move on to another guest of ours, another guest panelist who's joining us online. I'd like to introduce Francesco Michel, who is the Strategic Analysis and Advocacy Officer for the Global Protection Cluster. And he's joined by Friederike Schmitz, who is Protection Sector Co-Coordinator in Nigeria. And Francesco and Friederike are going to give an overview of how they use the common process to identify challenges and solutions for better protection analysis by countries. So over to you, Francesco and Friederike.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
We can.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. And it's great to be part of this panel. Thank you very much for the invitation. And the presentation from the colleagues has been quite inspiring. And I'm part a bit of about the process we are gonna provide an example of, but we are gonna take a bit probably a much more eagle-eye approach. From the protection cluster side, we've been really excited to participate in this event, because actually the question on how do we trace back to the data to get better decision making is a long-standing question. And specifically in the last couple of years, we have been looking at how we can, as cluster or support of our cluster members or our colleagues of the AORs, on what type of action we can take on protection. We've been reflecting quite extensively about that. And among the different streams of work that we have envisaged, we realized that we have to get better in providing timely, actionable, strategic, programmatic, and advocacy recommendations coming from the analysis, coming from our operations, specifically to humanitarian coordinator, humanitarian country team, and member state. The example of the colleagues in Somalia is one of those examples where protection is fundamental for the response, and it's our role to actually identify what better actions. So in that case, it's amazing. On our side, we realized that looking back at the data, what is fundamental as protection clusters is to be able and be better in identifying most urgent, most important protection risks. But not only the protection risks, also everything that is around them, which resources we have, which capacity, which services are in place, which common drivers and trends. So this sparkled a bit the exercise and the example we're providing today. Next slide, please. We have been, in the last 2 years, we've been working, as I was saying, a lot on these processes, and we developed a protection analytical framework that now is commonly used across operations. But specifically at the end of last year, we ran a full-fledged lessons learned exercise on all our work on analysis, both at global level and in. Sorry, I've been muted. Sorry, someone speaking below me, but I hope you can hear. So I was saying that we have been running an exercise of challenges and lessons learned, looking specifically now to use better data. And some of them might resonate with you, but The protection cluster is a wide network. We had very strong partner, very strong area of responsibility partnerships, but sometimes we don't use the data sets and the data we collect together, combined, but we use them mostly in isolation. And then we realized as well that this is as a general challenge, that sometimes we don't use all the existing data and information. And this brings to duplication of efforts and so on. But most importantly, and that's what brought us to the exercise that we did, is that if we really want to be better in the decision, we have to get better in pulling together the data. And one of the main challenges is that we found wide difference in terminology and concept of the data sets we have. So on this, we focus specifically, next slide, and we engage our, actually many of the colleagues in the panel today and other colleagues from the areas of responsibility to look together at our core protection risks definitions. Next slide, please, Damien. So what we had a common list of 15 protection risks that we were using for a global tracker, but we realized that we had to work better to make it much more authoritative and consistent to actually to be used for data to actually tag and organize data and information. And next, Daniel. And the two major aspects that we are driving and we're working on, and we'll be continue working in the next year, is to actually use the protection risk as common categories to link together different data sets. So from the 4 or 5 Ws that we use for services, from the information we collect for HRPs and other type of information in our protection analysis. This is really helpful because then on the side of the use of the results of the analysis, so on advocacy, programming, and strategy, we can use them more consistently and provide very strong analysis that actually are enriched by the different data set of both partners and colleagues of the AORs. Next slide, please. This is a bit the sort of snapshot of the process we've been undertaking so far with actually some of the colleagues on panel and others. But what I wanted to highlight here is that coming out with core definition and categories is not an easy exercise, and they might not never be perfect. So on our side, we decided to actually learn from operations. So all protection clusters now, they are using them. We develop a guidance, and we are actually collecting different mechanisms that are put in place at field level to find better ways together and collective ways to use data and information for evidence. So the idea is that all over the year, we're going to still work on that, and that will bring to additional revisions and further work and further collaboration. And next slide. This is the snapshot of the 15 protection risks. I will not delve into them. As you can see, just general, they are generally broad categories. And then the exercise we did so far is to generate core definitions, but also link better the languages with existing mechanisms, including the mechanisms from the collegial areas of responsibilities. Next, and then I will stop my presentation and hand it over to Federica. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I wanted to just basically showcase that in the process of taking decision and going back to data, it's difficult to have very common mechanisms that are global. So each country and context will have to identify their own processes. On our side, what we provided to protection clusters across our operation is 2 foundational elements. One is the protection analytical framework as a foundational element to organize data and information. And then the protection risks definition as the second foundational element to organize the evidence. Because sometimes we found that we were good in organizing the data, but then we had difficulties and challenges on actually to present it, to use it for decisions. So in doing so, our operation, the different approaches here, I just listed 3. Some of them, they went from mapping information and data against the protection analytical framework, and then they moved to prioritize, they used the list to prioritize then which information is needed for decisions. Other operations, they took the opposite approach. And then some other operation, like the case that Federica will present, they decided to embark in collective exercises to tag information and data against the protection analytical framework, and then using the 15 protection risks to look at gaps and have more collaborative approaches. I didn't mention the DTM, but the DTM is a fundamental data source that we have found in many protection analysis. And actually, we have constant dialogue to look better how also DTM information can be linked to protection risks and to use it more in our analysis. But I will stop there and hand it over to Federica, which is will present the case of Nigeria. Thank you, Federica, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. Yeah, so it has been great for the protection sector in Northeast Nigeria to work with the Global Protection Cluster on protection risk analysis and advocacies. And the challenges that were mentioned by Francesco really resonate with us in the Northeast. So the work in silos among partners, we had a lack of coherent evidence to even develop joint advocacy stands and then adjust the programming. This is why in Northeast Nigeria, we established the Protection Monitoring Technical Working Group for a protection monitoring system with harmonized tools. For our context, beyond the kind of technical challenges that Francesco mentioned, we are also operating in a very politicized environment. So there is oftentimes limited shared reading of the protection environment in the response, with competing narratives saying that the bulk of the conflict is over, humanitarian needs have significantly decreased, or there would be no humanitarian needs anymore, that now other interventions such as stabilization and development should be prioritized. In our context, we often also deal with a lot of state-driven terminologies. So for instance, we speak about camp closures and so-called returns. And we noticed that, the uncritical usage actually promotes that we only look at actions such as the action of closing a camp and relocating a population, while there has been limited analytical added value that actually makes us collectively understand protection risks. So the approach that we have taken to make it a bit practical, to kind of now break this down to our context, is that we set up the Protection Monitoring Technical Working Group, which is now consisting of 13 partners. And in that working group, we created a harmonized household assessment tool, as well as a protection incident reporting tool. And we have now seen the 13 partners actually collect data on the basis of those tools. We have just shared here screenshots of the tool, where you can also see the overview of the questions that are comprised in the tool. And what we have done basically is to tag this information and data against the protection analytical framework. Currently, we are in the process of identifying on that basis the protection risks and understanding the gaps that we have. On the next slide, thank you. You would see, for instance, the risk of forced displacement, which is very relevant for us in the northeast of Nigeria, where we have provided the authoritative GPC definition on the left here. And what we have are different questions in our household questionnaire that speak to this risk. So these questions give us more detailed information on the dimensions. So that includes questions in the section on displacement history. So we are asking, for instance, what is your household's area of origin? When were you last displaced? What was the cause of your displacement? But then also in our questionnaire, we have included so-called red flag questions. So these are questions for which we have defined thresholds. So for instance, in that question, have you noticed a displacement of more than 20 households in the last 2 weeks? And if that is crossed, it triggers a red flag email alert informing both the partner who has collected that information, but also the protection sector coordination team about this situation for real-time coordination, advocacy, and response. In the household questionnaire, we also have other sections, as I previously showed in the overview slide of the different sections, such as the ones on movement intentions. So those questions also help us understand the protection risk of forced displacement, where we would get information, for instance, what is the household movement intention, but also why does the household want to move, what factors in the current location, but then also in the preferred destination would want to make the household to move. So beyond that, we can also derive information on the protection risk of forced displacement from observation. So for instance, with protection monitors going out into the field, understanding what is the state of shelter, or is there no shelter? Are there tensions in the household or between households and the host community? Maybe what is the malnourishment or health situation? And then there are other questions across our questionnaire, which are indicative also in terms of forced displacement, as they might be raising concerns that are relevant for this protection risk. So that relates, for instance, to the security situation and safety. Yeah, so now for us, based on the protection monitoring household assessment tool that we have developed, we are following the process of data collection, interpretation, and analysis. And we have specific questions in the questionnaire that speak directly to a pillar or sub-pillar of the path. So key questions and the red flag questions, which we have tagged. So you can see here on the left side, a selection of questions from our household assessment questionnaire, and then how we have tagged them to the pillars and sub-pillars of the path. As an example, if we look at the question of movement intentions and why the household wants to move, you know, response options would be that the current location is not safe, or there's no access to basic services or commodities. We were able to directly link this to a sub-pillar of the protection analytical framework, and importantly, for some questions, we actually see that this relates to more than one dimension. So that question that I mentioned speaks to a direct threat. So safety, you know, as a threat, lack of access to services, etc. But it can also speak to the consequences of the threat to the affected population. So then we have also questions that raise those concerns, and partners would then follow up either with FGDs or KRIs or look into secondary data review to understand the situation around that protection risk better. So yeah, ultimately that exercise has helped us relating the questions to the path, that tagging, to simplify information and very much give us a clearer understanding of the risk, here in that case, the risk of forced displacement. Because we understand what information we currently have, this is what you see here as the key areas, then the information that we need to identify to understand the risk better, and then ultimately knowing what is the source for us to be able to collaborate better with other actors within the response who have that data available. So for instance, if we look at the first one of protection threat on forced displacement, if we go back to that question on movement intentions, why does your household want to move? If we speak about those push and pull factors that the respondents would tell us about, for instance, a lack of safety in the current location or in the location of displacement, or the lack of or the availability of basic commodities. We know, for instance, that in terms of security, we also have a complementary tool, the protection incident reporting tool, that would give us a better understanding also of safety incidents. And then, of course, we know in the response there are other sources that we can consult, such as information from INSO, from UNDSS, etc., that we can bring in to complement the information to then really understand what is this risk of enforced displacement. Other things such as availability of basic commodities such as food, we can then consult, for instance, the integrated food security phase classification, and then overlay that information with the information that we have gathered through our questionnaire on an area-based approach. Yeah, so having all of that information helps us complement and really understand the protection risk, for instance, now of forced displacement more holistically, so that we can not only speak about actions on kind of a surface level, like camps are closed, populations are moved, but can really go deeper and understand what are the underlying protection risks or the protection risks that emanate out of those actions. Yeah, lastly, the data and analysis also needs to be captured. And to that end, we have developed an interactive dashboard for which we have presented the screenshots here. So the visualization follows the analysis of the protection analytical framework. So you would see here in the different boxes, basically the pillars of the path, where you can see context, threats, effects, and capacities and response. So this has helped us to take that information from the questionnaire and have a good structure for writing the analysis on the basis of the data. Importantly, also for us in the response, as I mentioned, we have currently 13 partners that are collecting data in the field. And this dashboard is also tailored just for them to see their own information through login. So that already allows the partner to access the analysis of their own data, and it has really facilitated partner buy-in, also so that they do not need to duplicate processes, but they already see the analysis rendered, so that we can collectively engage on the analysis and interpretation of the protection risks. Thank you.
Great, Francesco and Frederica, thank you for taking us in this deep dive. This is what it looks like to have a common approach. And because this is your day-to-day work, it'll be interesting very soon to get to our conversation with you. Some of the challenges right in the beginning that I noticed is that we don't use the data that we have. I think that's a cause for a lot of reflection, and I'll be curious to learn your experiences and how we can get more leverage from what we do have and how that informs action. And again, Francesco and Frederica, I think you've done a great job helping us understand what's done, which looks amazing, as well as giving us some pause for thought. We're going to move on to our last two panelists, and then afterwards, I hope that all of you are making a couple of notes of questions and experiences that you've had. Risky is then he's going to moderate the question and answers for the last hopefully about 20 minutes of our conversation. We'll end, by the way, at about past. So let me quickly move on to our last two speakers who will share their experiences. So we have Jennifer Chase and Astrid Halland. Jennifer is coordinator of the global. Oh, I'm sorry, Astrid. All right, then. All right, well, Jennifer and Astrid. Astrid, you are the coordinator, is it true? Astrid is the
Jennifer Chase is the global coordinator. I'm the deputy coordinator.
Very good. So from Global Gender-Based Violence, AOR, and we're really glad to have you both with us. And you are going to tell us a little bit about how you've used the common process to identify qualitative data needed for gender-based violence programming. And sorry that I kind of butchered your introduction, but we're
That's
so
fine.
curious.
You woke
to hear.
everyone up. We're the last speakers. So
Jennifer,
I think that was good. So a big thank you to you, Coco Warner, and Donia, who we've been working with for several years. So thank you for inviting us today to speak together with our protection colleagues. Our collaboration already goes back a while, as I mentioned. We've been working to have the standard GBV indicators into DTM, which now exists. And that is an important source of information for the GBV coordination teams at field level. It's one source of information that we then combine, as we'll see later when I hand over to Jennifer Miquel, with more qualitative data. We've also worked together with Donia on capacity strengthening in terms of safe and ethical collection of data and interpretation of GBV data, where we've seen that, well, strengthening in a way the DTM, but also some of our own community in the field on how we use the data. I'll soon hand over to Jennifer Miquel, who recently joined the UNFPA Humanitarian Response Division here in Geneva, from her previous role as the head of the Regional Syria Crisis Hub for UNFPA. She will talk to the importance of using qualitative data, ensuring that the voices of women and girls and affected populations are heard and are part of what the basis on which we take decisions. The Voices project was initiated in Syria in collaboration with the protection cluster there, so with a lot of you in the room and online. Why is it so important for us to have different sources of information and to bring in this qualitative data? It's because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, GBV is difficult to measure already in stable settings, even more in humanitarian settings, and in particular, measuring a change over time is very difficult for us in quantitative terms. That said, we know it happens everywhere and it's often underreported due to stigma, retaliation, limited availability and access to services, and sometimes it's also a question of impunity or that people might not trust the services or not be aware of the benefits of seeking services. I could go on more, but looking at the time, I think the more important is that I hand over to my colleague Jennifer Miquel to guide us through the experience from Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And indeed, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I am the other Jennifer in UNFPA, humanitarian responses. It happens all the time, so no problem at all. So I am going to talk to you about how we've used data, but specifically and especially qualitative data to improve the gender-based violence response in Syria. And I'm going to talk about, it's this Voices from Syria report that we produce now on an annual basis in the context of the humanitarian needs overview. We're on the 8th one, I think, now. And really, it's the aim of the Voices from Syria report is to support and inform GBV organizations to provide them with the information that they need to develop their response, their GBV response. It's also for non-specialized GBV organizations, humanitarian workers, to inform them of the risks of GBV and also in other sectors. Again, to try to improve the overall humanitarian response. This approach has been evaluated a number of times, one by an independent evaluation of UNFPA's regional Syria response and its coordination, and it was identified as a best practice and a blueprint to be replicated in other responses, which it has been, and I'll reference that later. It's also, was identified as a really good practice through interaction, results-based protection practices context, and also at the SVRI, which is the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. They have global conferences and meetings, and this was also identified as a good practice. So it all started quite a while ago, and when we were doing the first humanitarian response plan for Syria, and for the whole of Syria, I should say, and we had very, very limited data on, in context, we had very limited data on GBV. While we know that we don't need numbers to respond to GBV, to develop a GBV response, we do need to have more nuanced information about the types of violence, where it happens, why it happens, and so on, to really be able to provide a response. So we wanted to go beyond saying we don't need data on GBV to develop the response. But it was a challenging context of there was security risks. There were not that many GBV or protection partners, certainly at that time. It was a very siloed response. There's many cross-border operations and government-controlled area operations, and they're quite siloed at the time. There was some quantitative data, but it was not particularly reliable for protection issues, and I can go into more details if you want about this. And it's also a remote management context. So what we agreed to do, and this was, so this is where the GBV AOR for the whole of Syria really pushed to have more of a qualitative approach to gathering data, and we collaborated with General Protection, Child Protection, Mine Action on an approach to gather qualitative data. We agreed on common tools, on common indicators. There were some that were more specific to, obviously, to each of the AORs and General Protection, but it was used all across Syria, so that was also an important part for us. And we agreed to do community focus group discussions, and those were separated between men, women, adolescent girls and adolescent boys. But really, we had much more, we focused more on women and adolescent girls because all the other data didn't actually have that. And we also did expert focus group discussions, and this is more with the GBV experts at different, and this was different hub levels, so different regions of Syria, to also triangulate the information. We use the Delphi method because that's a consensus building tool, but you could also use different methodologies. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail around the methodology because we produced a report called Beyond Numbers, which you can find online, that really details out the whole methodology and how we've done it, and the sampling criteria, the how to produce the report, and all those details. And of course, we also do use a little bit of, we do use some quantitative data now more and more because it's, we've been able to use more proxy indicators, and there's more female enumerators and these sort of things. And so we do include some quantitative data in the report now. But let me focus more on the impact of the report and the data that we use. It really is also part of a tool of accountability to affected populations, right? It really highlights the voices of women and girls and men and boys that in the response. And especially, I mean, I want to highlight the voices of adolescent girls because they tend to be invisible still in humanitarian responses and in the data. We still have a lot of places where it's above 18, under 18, or above 5, and adolescent girls become completely invisible. And you know, having the voices from women, men, adolescent boys, and adolescent girls, we use their voices, their quotes in the reports. So it's not an interpretation anymore. It is what it is, and I think, and that's actually very helpful as well. I mean, it's also been able to improve the response. So now in Syria, you have a much more targeted response across the area. The data that we collect is also in the report, is also organized. There's an overall analysis, but it's also organized by geographical area. So you know which types of violence are more you know, I don't want to use the word prevalent, but are discussed more in certain places, or there's where there's more problems of access, or access to services, or where there's less services. So there's a much more targeted response also in terms of the types of violence that exists. So we've also been able to produce a specific adolescent growth strategy. For example, there was a lot of references to child marriages one year. And what we were able to do is then, based on the data, take a step back and actually create a whole framework around addressing the needs of adolescent girls with different sectors as well. And there's many more services now, but there's also much more information around the different risks of GBV for other clusters and sectors. And so this is something that's also included in the report, and that we also provide to all the different sectors and clusters. We've also evaluated, and well, no, we did a survey on the impact of the report, and we did send it to the members of the GBV coordination group, and they found that it helped them better design and adapt interventions, that it helped with our advocacy issues, that it helped inform donors, helped better understand the types of violence that exists, helped inform partners to identify affected populations, and also different areas of interventions. It really supported also our advocacy efforts. Unfortunately, we're still in a place where you do have, we're requested for numbers of survivors, or, you know, to better understand the response. We can actually show this report, provide this report, and say, no, you don't actually, you have all the information that you need. And it really has helped senior humanitarian leadership, the regional humanitarian coordinator in Syria, or the HC in Syria, advocate for the issues because they had all the information that was simpler. So the report, I should say, is quite big. It's over 100 pages, but we've also produced more of an advocacy brief around 4 pages that's much more easily digestible for and less for programmatic reasons, but more for advocacy reasons. And it also supported funding for GBV because donors have been able to use this. So when they get the proposals, they know, is it based on the information that's available? And it's also been able to guide the response. I mean, the main lesson learned, is certainly in the context of this discussion, is that the use of the qualitative data gave us much more nuanced information. And while we could triangulate it for other things, that having the voices of women and girls tell us, for example, there's a quote here, you know, longing for peace in a place that feels like home once again. As mothers, we want to feel that our children have a future that does not look like our present, is much more powerful than us saying there's a problem on GBV in Syria. And then we share these quotes also with OCHA, and they go into the HNO, but they also go into the HRP and so on. These are some of the more quotes, for example, that we get. But I want to also say that and conclude that this report has been, and this methodology has been replicated in different places. Sudan was the first one, and I look at Max here, who's also in the room, who was the rep of Sudan at the time, and who is now our deputy director for the humanitarian response division of UNFPA. And this was replicated in Sudan. So now, if you look at what's happening in Sudan, well, there's, you know, the situation right now is very chaotic, but there is a baseline of GBV, of what, you know, of GBV in Sudan, in different regions, what their issues are. So you're not starting from scratch. This will help inform the response now that is being organized in Sudan. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers, both online and here on our panel, and Jennifer McKell, as well as you, of course. Let's turn now to your questions and a little bit more of interactive. And Risky, would you like to switch places so that you can have access? Or? All right, that's fine.
I have the easiest task of the day, just to moderate a couple of questions. I think we have 10 more minutes, so maybe we'll use 7 or 8 before I hand over to Coco for closing, and open the floor for questions. We're monitoring the online connection also for any questions from colleagues online. So the floor is open. We'll take, I don't know how many we'll get, but we'll take to like 4 or 5 probably to start with, if there is any. And online colleagues, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We can also give the floor probably. No? Yes. If you can use the microphone. So
hello. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for this, really interesting. So I'm Jim Robinson. I'm the co-coordinator of the Housing, Land and Property Area of Responsibility. And I look on jealously at this collaboration. And yeah, I think just it's really interesting to hear how you've worked together in the Syria context, but even more broadly, how you've partnered with DTM and identifying these gaps and looking at ways to find ways to get the information and the data that you need. So it's less of a question and more just an appreciation of that work. And I'm really keen from our side to look at how we can join in and to explore what might be possible to include some issues around particularly security of tenure and land housing issues as they sort of cut right across the work of the other AORs in the protection cluster. So more just an appreciation and thanks for the work and really interesting to hear about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Daunia, do you want to say Something down is the one that's been.
No, I was just going to tell him, let's touch base and start working a bit closer together. Maybe a question from my side, a little bit of a provocation. We insist a lot, and Coco has been talking about a common approach. And during the grand bargain works, we started thinking, or we decided that we all agreed on a process that would start with identifying the ultimate use of information, identify the information needs, and only at that point move into developing questions, which is, if I look at my life, professional life, I have for many years done exactly the opposite, and I think a lot of us have. Let's go and write a questionnaire, and then we'll find a use for that information. So we have seen that it needs to be the other way around. I don't know who wants to answer this question, but have you noticed a difference in the results, in the usability and usefulness of the information when you use a different approach? Over.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, maybe I'll head over to the panelists in case anyone wants to tackle that one.
I'll start. I mean, for Syria, we actually always started with, what do we need to know? We had a set of indicators that were very clear around, before we started writing anything. I think some of the indicators were around things like the types of violence, different coping strategies. We had one on safe distributions, because we didn't want to talk, to try to get to sexual exploitation and abuse. So it was quite clear where we wanted to start from. I think our challenge in Syria has also been limiting the amount of data that we want to collect. So the tools, which are, again, they're available online through this Beyond Number report, but would get really quite long, because that's where, lots of people, everyone wants their questions in, and then certainly with focus group discussions, you don't want to keep people for hours and hours. So I think that was one of the main challenges, and still one that we tried to face. But I have to say, at least from the Syria perspective, it was very clear: start with what you need to know before you start, just collecting information.
Maybe just one sentence. I'm not ready yet to respond to the results and the difference, but it's true. I think across the protection cluster, we've done a much more in terms of always emphasizing the need to have secondary data reviews and looking at what you have before we start collecting new data and getting people involved, both in terms of spending money, but also in terms of asking people so many times, what are the issues? And,
maybe a couple of thoughts. On victim assistance, I mean, the MAOR has done a lot of advocacy for assistance to survivors of explosive ordnance. And there's been a lot of colleagues, especially from HI, Humanity and Inclusion, working on this. And they often said, we need more information, persons with disability are invisible in humanitarian assistance. And they invested a lot in collecting more information on persons with disabilities. And then at the end, basically, I mean, for me, the two main conclusions is that, one, we really need to involve them, and they tell us, no, nothing without us. We need to consult them, and they need to be in a decision-making committee. And the second thing I would say is that we know enough. We know enough to act and to assist and to support, and sometimes trying to always find more information is almost for me like an excuse for doing nothing until we have the perfect information, which never happens in an emergency. So I think we have to trust our judgment much better and consult affected population much better as well, and that will help us also to improve the, I would say, the impact of our interventions. And then I would really like to have a follow-up conversation on this common approach, because I completely agree with you. But then after seeing all our presentation, you see that we have very different approaches. Like your reported voice sounds fabulous. I don't know where are the person with disability or the EO survivors in that report, but perhaps they are great, fabulous, because I hadn't seen it. So I'm just thinking, you know, how do we promote this common approach? And you in DTM, you must see the silos between us in the AORs, in the protection cluster. If you have any suggestions to help us have this common approach, I think I mean, I personally would be very interested in working with you. And you know, that's one of the recommendations of the OGI review of protection, that we need to, I mean, they say simplify, but basically is harmonize and be more joined up, basically. Thank you.
Also want to give the quick opportunity to panelists that are online, if any of you would like to comment.
May I come in? This is Joyce.
Yes, go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, just to quickly to also add, I mean, I think on the question on how we've seen the changes, I think for Somalia, we saw how we could use the information that we already had on the impact of drought on child protection from previous years to push for protection, and specifically for child protection to be included as one of the priority areas for the response. And then using the interagency analysis that was already available from the food security cluster, from the nutrition cluster, and other clusters to help us prioritize on the areas. So the areas had already been agreed on where all the clusters would prioritize the response on. And based on that interagency analysis and prioritization, we then focused on looking at what services do we need to deliver for children, what is the capacity that is available for the delivery of the services. And usually we would spend a lot of time trying to do assessments initially, trying to gather information, but we use the information that was already there to help us make the decisions on where we would be responding. And then we took the time to do an analysis, also cross-analyzing with the grey violations, how grey violations are happening in areas which are most affected by the drought, and prioritizing then the response and looking at the services and how they could be improved. So also looking at the capacity of the partners and focusing on the quality of service delivery, as opposed to doing assessments and collecting data, which takes up a lot of time, especially in a response where it's already clear how the drought is affecting children in terms of child protection. So I think that was a good opportunity for us to show how we can already use the information that we have to respond, but also to use that opportunity to prioritize and improve the quality of the response. So I hope that kind of answers the question from the child protection perspective. And I'll hand over to Francesco, because I know he had raised his hand before me. Sorry, Francesco, thanks.
Absolutely, no, sorry, Joyce, no worries. Now, for the sake of time, I will just say two sentences very quickly. One is, on the positive side, I think that what we are starting seeing in our operation, at least from our side, is that the work on protection risk specifically is helping mostly all of us bringing together better many of the approaches that you presented today. I mean, maybe contrary to Christelle, I see a common approach. Maybe we have different ways because of the dimension that we actually respond to are different, but we have seen that we have all the same intentions, and we still don't have data, and it's something that we're looking into the feedback. But yeah, we start seeing a much better use of existing data and a much quicker use of the existing data for analysis. That's the two things that I can just say. But then I wanted just to put a reflection, which is probably the challenge. Sometimes with one data, we want to make more than one decision. So that's a bit the challenge. So it's not just taking what decision we want to make and go back to the data, but what is the layers of decision we want to make, both individually and collectively, and then going back to the data. That's quite an inherent challenge that we have to consider. But I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce and Francisco. I think I'm going to close the Q&A session here and hand over to Coco, but just want to say, if any of you have questions, follow up after this session, either online or in person, please feel free to send us your queries. So with that, back to Coco.
Thanks so much, Risky, and for everybody who's spent your precious time with us this morning, talking about a common approach to data that is used to inform action. We really appreciate both our online speakers as well as you here in the room, our wonderful panelists. You are helping us understand the experiences and needs of people in really hard to reach places who are facing great stress and who we have some ability, I'm not claiming everything, but we do have some ability to offer assistance. The risks are growing, and that gives us both a daunting challenge as well as an opportunity through data to bring those experiences and those needs and connect them to the institutions that can offer assistance to prepare, to anticipate, to reduce risk. And I hope that DTM, among others, but since I come from IOM, I'm just going to offer that as a vehicle. I hope that we can continue joining up our data sets and be smarter and even more impactful. It's clearly building on the partnership that you've already started some years back, and we have a world of opportunity as well as need to address moving forward. So thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to meet you and to be here. Thanks, Risky, and have a great lunchtime. Good luck this week.